In the chilling autumn of 1897, a scream tore through York County's Rehmeyer Hollow, where Nelson Rehmeyer, a suspected hex doctor, lay dead in his cursed farmhouse. His body, battered and scorched, told a story of fear turned deadly. The rolling hills of York County, Pennsylvania, stretched wide under a sky heavy with secrets. In this rural enclave, German settlers had planted not just crops but old-world beliefs, tales of powwow doctors who wielded magic as easily as they did a plow. These practitioners, blending Christian prayers with arcane rituals, were both revered and feared, their chants said to mend bones or curdle milk. Nelson Rehmeyer, a quiet farmer with a piercing gaze, was one such figure, or so the whispers claimed. His name carried weight, spoken in hushed tones by firelight, as if saying it too loudly might summon his power. To some, he was a healer, easing fevers with herbs. To others, he was a witch, his shadow enough to blight a harvest. Rehmeyer's farmhouse crouched in a hollow, its sagging timbers groaning under the wind's relentless push. Locals gave it a wide berth, their footsteps quickening as they passed. Tales of his curses were legion, a cow dropping dead after he glanced at it, a child's sudden illness tied to his muttered words. No evidence ever pinned these misfortunes to him, but in a place where superstition ruled, evidence was beside the point. By 1897, fear had woven a noose around Rehmeyer's name, tightened by every failed crop or unexplained death. 3 men, John Blymeyer, Wilbert Hess, and Milton Hess, became the instruments of that fear, their lives unraveling under what they believed was his dark influence. John Blymeyer was no ordinary farmer. A powwow practitioner himself, he'd once commanded respect, his hands said to carry healing power. But by 1897, his world was crumbling. His crops withered, his money vanished, and a nameless dread gnawed at his soul. He sought answers from other practitioners, each one pointing to a hex, a curse sapping his strength. One name surfaced again and again: Rehmeyer. Blymeyer's obsession grew, his nights sleepless, his thoughts consumed by the idea that Rehmeyer's magic was choking his life. The Hess brothers, Wilbert and Milton, shared his terror. Their family's farm was failing, their health faltering, their livestock dying without cause. To them, Rehmeyer wasn't just a man, he was a specter, his influence a poison seeping into their blood. The 3 men found each other in their shared desperation, their conversations turning from whispers to plans. Powwow lore offered a solution. To break a hex, you needed the witch's spell book or a lock of their hair. Burn those, and the curse would die. It was a simple ritual, one they believed would free them without blood. On a frigid November night, they set out for Rehmeyer's Hollow, the moon hidden, the air sharp enough to cut. They carried knives, a coil of rope, and hearts pounding with equal parts fear and resolve. The hollow was silent save for the crunch of frost underfoot, the farmhouse looming like a beast waiting to swallow them whole. Rehmeyer answered their knock, his face calm, almost mocking. He invited them in, his voice steady, as if he'd been expecting them. The men hesitated, their plan unraveling in the face of his composure. They demanded his spellbook, their voices trembling. Rehmeyer laughed, denying he was anything but a farmer. The air grew thick, words turning to shouts, shouts to shoves. What began as a ritual spiraled into chaos. A blow landed, then another, until Rehmeyer lay motionless, his blood pooling on the floorboards. Panic took hold. They doused the room with kerosene, struck a match, and fled, believing the fire would erase their sin. But the flames faltered, leaving the house scarred but standing, a witness to their crime. By morning, neighbors found the smoldering ruin and Rehmeyer's broken body. The stench of burnt flesh hung heavy, a grim herald of the violence. Word spread through York County like a plague, each telling twisting the tale. The hex doctor was dead, but his power wasn't. The sheriff moved swiftly, arresting Blymeyer and the Hess brothers within days. Their guilt was plain in their haunted eyes, their hands still shaking from the night's horror. At trial, they didn't deny the act, only the intent. "We meant to weaken him," Blymeyer pleaded, his voice cracking. "Not kill him." The jury saw no difference. Blymeyer faced life in prison, the Hess brothers lesser terms, but the verdict did little to quiet the Hollow's whispers. The Hex house stood defiant, its blackened walls a monument to the murder. Locals swore they heard voices in the wind, saw shadows flicker in the windows. The trial left questions dangling. Who struck the killing blow? Was Rehmeyer a witch or just a man caught in a storm of fear? No spellbook was ever found, no proof of curses beyond the paranoia that birthed them. The Hollow became a place to avoid, its air thick with unease, as if the land itself remembered the blood spilled. The murder of Nelson Rehmeyer wasn't just a crime. It was a spark, igniting a legend that would haunt York County for generations, a tale of superstition and the darkness it can unleash. In the wake of Nelson Rehmeyer's murder, York County's air grew heavier, as if the Hollow itself exhaled dread. The year was 1897, and the Hex house, charred but unyielding, stood as a grim reminder of the night fear turned to blood. John Blymeyer, Wilbert Hess, and Milton Hess sat in cells, their fates now tethered to a trial that would unravel their motives but not the mystery. The community, gripped by superstition, whispered of curses unbroken, of a darkness that lingered where Rehmeyer fell. This wasn't just a killing. It was a wound in the fabric of the Hollow, one that refused to heal. York County's people were no strangers to the occult. Their ancestors, German immigrants who settled these hills, brought with them a world of hexerei and powwow magic. These traditions weren't mere folklore. They were a way of life, woven into the rhythm of planting and harvest. Powwow doctors, like Blymeyer himself, were consulted for everything from fever to failed crops, their rituals a blend of prayer and mysticism. But where healing thrived, so did fear. A powwow doctor could be a savior or a sorcerer, and Rehmeyer, with his solitary ways and piercing eyes, had long been marked as the latter by those who crossed his path. John Blymeyer's descent into obsession began years before the murder. Once a respected practitioner, he'd seen his own powers falter. His hands, once steady with healing, now trembled with doubt. Crops died, money slipped away, and a shadow seemed to follow him, a weight he couldn't shake. He sought out other powwow doctors, each one feeding his fear that a hex was at work. When a practitioner named Andrew Lenhart pointed to Rehmeyer as the source, Blymeyer's dread found a target. Lenhart, a man of cryptic words and strange rituals, claimed Rehmeyer's magic was a blight, not just on Blymeyer, but on the entire Hollow. The accusation took root, growing wild in Blymeyer's mind. The Hess brothers, Wilbert and Milton, were equally ensnared. Their family's farm, once prosperous, was failing. Livestock sickened, fields turned barren, and their mother's health crumbled. They too consulted powwow practitioners, and the same name surfaced, Rehmeyer. To Wilbert, a quiet man worn down by hardship, the idea of a curse made sense. It explained the inexplicable. Milton, younger and more impulsive, burned with anger, eager to confront the man they believed was their ruin. Together, the three men formed a pact, bound not by friendship, but by a shared conviction that Rehmeyer's power had to be stopped. Their plan, born in the dim light of a tavern, was rooted in powwow lore. A hex doctor's strength, they believed, lay in their spellbook or a lock of their hair. Steal these, burn them, and the curse would break. It was a ritual, not a murder, they told themselves. They gathered their tools, knives for cutting hair, rope to bind if needed, and set out under a sky black as coal. The Hollow was silent, the kind of quiet that presses against the ears. Rehmeyer's farmhouse loomed ahead, its windows dark, its presence almost alive, as if it knew what was coming. Inside, the encounter was nothing like they'd imagined. Rehmeyer, tall and unflinching, met their demands with a scoff. He had no spellbook, he said, no magic to confess. His denial only fueled their panic. Blymeyer, trembling with a mix of fear and rage, pushed forward, his voice rising. Wilbert, usually reserved, joined in, his desperation breaking through. Milton, the hothead, threw the first blow, a wild swing that caught Rehmeyer off guard. The room erupted. Fists, feet, and blades met flesh, the men lost in a frenzy they couldn't explain. When it was over, Rehmeyer was dead, his body a broken heap on the floor. They hadn't meant to kill him. That's what they told themselves as they poured kerosene, their hands shaking so badly the match nearly fell. The fire was meant to erase their mistake, to burn away the evidence and the curse, but the flames refused to take hold, licking the walls without consuming them. The men fled, their breath ragged, their minds racing with the weight of what they'd done. They stumbled through the hollow, the cold biting at their skin, each step pulling them deeper into a nightmare they couldn't escape. By dawn, the smoke drew neighbors to the scene. They found Rehmeyer's body, his face unrecognizable, the air thick with the smell of death. The community reeled, torn between grief and fear. Some mourned Rehmeyer as a neighbor, others whispered he'd gotten what he deserved. The sheriff, a pragmatic man named Jacob Hoover, wasted no time. He tracked down Blymeyer and the Hess brothers, their guilt written in their haunted stares. They confessed quickly, their stories aligning on one point: they only wanted to break the hex. But the blood on their hands told a different story. The trial loomed, and York County braced for answers. Yet the more the story unfolded, the murkier it became. No spellbook was found, no proof of Rehmeyer's witchcraft beyond the tales that had damned him. The hollow, with its blackened farmhouse, seemed to mock the proceedings, as if it held secrets the courtroom could never touch. Locals began to avoid the place, claiming the ground itself felt wrong, heavy with a presence that lingered long after the fire died. The murder wasn't just a crime. It was a spark that set York County's deepest fears ablaze. A story that would echo through the hollow for decades, whispering of curses and the men who tried to break them. The Hex House murder sent shivers through York County, its echoes louder than the church bells on Sunday. In 1897, Nelson Rehmeyer's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a fracture in the community's soul, splitting neighbors between those who mourned and those who feared the curse lived on. The trial of John Blymeyer, Wilbert Hess, and Milton Hess was set to begin, and the hollow, still smoldering, seemed to watch in silence. The truth, if it could be found, lay buried in a tangle of superstition, guilt, and whispers that refused to die. The courthouse in York was a sturdy brick building, its walls a stark contrast to the wild fears that swirled outside. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, the benches packed with farmers, shopkeepers, and powwow believers, all eager for answers. The prosecution painted a grim picture. 3 men, driven by delusion, had beaten and burned a neighbor, their minds poisoned by tales of witchcraft. The defense, however, leaned into the county's folklore, arguing that Blymeyer and the Hess brothers were victims of their own beliefs, desperate to save themselves from a hex they thought was real. John Blymeyer took the stand first, his face gaunt, his eyes darting like a cornered animal. He spoke of his life before the murder, when he'd been a healer, trusted to ease pain with words and herbs. But his world had crumbled, his crops failed, his wife grew distant, and a sickness he couldn't name drained his strength. He described visiting powwow doctors, each one confirming his fears of a curse. When Andrew Lenhart named Rehmeyer as the source, Blymeyer said it was like a fog lifting, revealing the enemy he'd been fighting all along. His voice cracked as he recounted the night in the Hex House, insisting they only wanted Rehmeyer's spellbook, not his life. Wilbert Hess followed, his testimony quieter but no less haunted. A man of few words, he spoke of his family's struggles, the barren fields, the dying livestock, the shadow over his mother's health. He'd trusted Blymeyer, a fellow believer in powwow, to guide them. Wilbert admitted to carrying a knife that night, but swore he only meant to cut a lock of Rehmeyer's hair. When the argument turned violent, he said he froze, watching as blows rained down. His regret was palpable, but so was his fear. not of the law, but of the curse he still believed held sway. Milton Hess, the youngest, was defiant. His testimony burned with anger, not at Rehmeyer, but at the world that had let his family suffer. He described the hollow as a place where hope went to die, where every misfortune pointed to Rehmeyer's hand. Milton admitted to striking Rehmeyer, but claimed it was in self-defense, that the older man had lunged first. The courtroom stirred at this, whispers rippling through the crowd. No one could verify his story, but Milton's conviction was unshakable, his belief in Rehmeyer's power as real as the gavel on the judge's bench. The prosecution called witnesses, neighbors who'd known Rehmeyer as a solitary but kind man. A farmer testified that Rehmeyer had helped him mend a fence, asking nothing in return. A widow spoke of his herbal remedies, which eased her arthritis when no doctor could. But others told darker tales, of barren cows and sick children, of strange lights in the hollow at night. The jury, a mix of locals steeped in the same superstitions, listened with rapt attention. They knew the weight of a hex, the way a whispered curse could feel heavier than stone. No physical evidence tied the men to a premeditated murder. The knives and rope were explained away as tools for the ritual, not weapons. The kerosene, they claimed, was a panicked afterthought. Yet Rehmeyer's body told a brutal story, his skull fractured, his ribs broken, his skin charred. The prosecution argued this was no accident, but a slaughter born of blind fear. The defense countered that the men were trapped in a worldview where hexes were real, their actions a desperate bid for survival in a world they couldn't control. The trial wasn't just about guilt, it was a reckoning with York County's soul. Powwow beliefs, once a quiet part of life, were now on display, dissected by lawyers who didn't understand their power. Some spectators saw the defendants as victims of their own faith, others as murderers hiding behind folklore. The judge, a stern man named Thomas Cochran, urged the jury to focus on facts, not rumors of curses. But in a place like York County, facts were slippery, overshadowed by the weight of belief. As the trial drew to a close, the hex house loomed larger than ever. Locals reported strange happenings, whispers in the wind, shadows moving where no one stood. One farmer swore he saw Rehmeyer's face in the farmhouse window, his eyes glowing like embers. The stories grew, feeding the fear that the hollow was cursed, that Rehmeyer's death had only strengthened its hold. The jury deliberated for hours, their faces pale, as if they felt the hollow's gaze. When they returned, their verdict was clear. Guilty, all three men. Blymeyer received life, Wilbert and Milton lesser terms. The gavel fell, but the questions lingered. Who struck the fatal blow? Was Rehmeyer a witch or a scapegoat for a community's fears? The hex house offered no answers, its scorched walls silent but heavy with secrets. York County tried to move on, but the hollow wouldn't let it. The murder had torn open a wound, exposing the raw nerve of superstition that ran through the land. As winter settled over the hills, the whispers grew louder, the shadows darker, and the legend of Nelson Rehmeyer began to take root, a story that would haunt the hollow long after the trial ended. The verdict rang out in York County's courthouse, but the hex house murder left a scar that no gavel could heal. It was late 1897, and Nelson Rehmeyer's death had cracked the community open, exposing fears that ran deeper than the roots of the old oaks in Rehmeyer's hollow. John Blymeyer was bound for a life behind bars, while Wilbert and Milton Hess faced shorter sentences, but the hollow itself seemed to judge them all. The farmhouse, blackened by fire yet standing, whispered of curses unbroken, its shadow stretching across the hills like a warning. Life in York County was shaped by the land, fields that fed families, forests that hid secrets. The German settlers who'd carved out this place brought with them a belief in the unseen, a world where hexes could twist fate as surely as a drought could kill a crop. Powwow doctors were part of this fabric, their rituals a lifeline for those who trusted neither medicine nor prayer alone. But Rehmeyer's death had turned that trust inside out. Neighbors who once sought his remedies now wondered if they'd invited a devil into their homes. his cures masking darker intentions. The trial had done little to quiet these fears. If anything, it amplified them, giving voice to stories that had festered in whispers. Some swore Rehmeyer had been more than a healer, his knowledge drawn from forbidden books passed down through generations. Others saw him as a victim, a quiet man whose solitude made him a target for paranoia. The lack of a spell book, no leather-bound tome of curses ever found, only deepened the mystery. Had the men destroyed it in the fire, or had it never existed? The hollow offered no answers, its silence as oppressive as the frost that coated its trees. Rehmeyer's life sentence weighed heaviest. In his cell, he was said to pray ceaselessly, his lips moving with powwow chants, as if he could still break the hex he believed had driven him to murder. He spoke of Rehmeyer as a force, not a man, a presence that haunted his dreams even now. Wilbert Hess, confined to a lighter sentence, was quieter, his guilt a private burden. He wrote letters to his family, begging forgiveness, but never spoke of the hollow, as if naming it might summon its power. Milton, the fiery youngest, grew bitter, insisting they'd been right to confront Rehmeyer, that the real crime was the curse left unchecked. The community, meanwhile, grappled with its own demons. Farmers who'd once traded stories of Rehmeyer's cures now avoided his name, fearing it carried weight. Children were warned to steer clear of the hollow, where the hex house stood like a gravestone. Strange tales emerged. A hunter who heard footsteps behind him but found no tracks. A woman who saw a figure in the farmhouse window, its face blurred but familiar. These stories weren't dismissed as fancy. In York County, the line between truth and tale was thin, and the hollow seemed to blur it further. The sheriff, Jacob Hoover, tried to restore order, urging folks to let the law settle the matter. But law couldn't touch the unease that clung to the land. He'd seen the hex house himself, its charred beams and broken windows, and though he scoffed at curses, he admitted the place felt wrong, like a wound that wouldn't close. His deputies reported oddities, horses refusing to pass the hollow, dogs whining at its edge. Even skeptics felt it, a heaviness, a sense that the air itself was watching, waiting for something to stir. Rehmeyer's family, what little remained, kept their distance. His sister, living miles away, refused to claim his belongings, saying the hollow had tainted them. His farm was left to rot, its fields unplowed, its barn collapsing under neglect. Some said the land was cursed now, poisoned by the blood spilled in the house. Others believed Rehmeyer's spirit lingered, tethered to the place where he died. A few brave souls ventured to the hex house, hoping to salvage tools or timber, but they returned empty-handed, their nerves frayed, swearing they'd felt eyes on their backs. The powwow tradition, once a cornerstone of York County life, began to falter. Practitioners like Andrew Lenhart, who'd pointed Rehmeyer to Rehmeyer, faced suspicion. Some hid their books. Others stopped their rituals altogether, fearing they'd be next. The murder had cast a shadow over their craft, turning healers into potential hexers in the eyes of a wary community. Churches, long uneasy with powwow's blend of faith and magic, seized the moment, preaching against its dangers. Yet in quiet corners, some still whispered chants, unable to let go of the old ways. As winter deepened, the hollow grew quieter but not peaceful. The hex house became a pilgrimage for the curious, those drawn to its darkness. They came at dusk, their lanterns casting long shadows, hoping to glimpse the supernatural. Most found nothing but cold air and creaking boards, yet their stories fed the legend. One man claimed his lantern flickered out for no reason. Another said he heard a voice calling his name. These tales spread, each one adding weight to the belief that Rehmeyer's death had awakened something that lingered in the hollow's frost-bitten earth. York County tried to move forward, but the murder was a stone dropped in still water, its ripples unending. The hex house stood as a reminder, its blackened walls a canvas for fear. Who had struck the final blow? Was Rehmeyer a witch, or a man undone by his neighbor's dread? The answers, if they existed, were locked in the hollow, guarded by a silence that felt alive. As 1897 drew to a close, The community braced for a long winter, knowing the story of Nelson Rehmeyer wasn't finished. It was only beginning to grow, a seed of horror planted deep in the heart of Pennsylvania's hills. Winter's grip tightened on York County in 1897, and Rehmeyer's Hollow seemed to hold its breath, as if the earth itself mourned Nelson Rehmeyer. The Hex House, scarred and silent, stood as a monument to the murder that had shaken the community to its core. The trial was over, but the questions it left behind festered like an open wound. John Blymeyer languished in prison. Wilbert and Milton Hess served their sentences, yet the Hollow's dark legacy grew, fed by whispers of curses and restless spirits. The murder had exposed the raw underbelly of York County's superstitions. For generations, the German settlers' powwow traditions had been a quiet strength, their rituals a shield against life's uncertainties. But Rehmeyer's death turned that shield into a blade, cutting through the trust that held the community together. Neighbors now eyed each other warily, wondering who else might harbor secret powers. The Hex House, with its blackened timbers and shattered windows, became a symbol of that betrayal, a place where faith had turned fatal. John Blymeyer's name carried a new weight in the county. Once a healer, he was now a cautionary tale, his life sentence a warning against the dangers of belief run wild. In his cell, he clung to his powwow rituals, whispering chants in the dark, convinced Rehmeyer's hex still lingered. His fellow inmates kept their distance, unnerved by his fervent mutterings. Some said he spoke to invisible forces, his eyes wild with fear that the curse had followed him behind bars. His obsession with Rehmeyer never faded, a ghost that haunted his every thought. Wilbert Hess, serving a shorter term, carried his guilt in silence. He rarely spoke of the murder, but his letters home revealed a man tormented by what he'd done. He wrote of dreams where the Hollow's trees reached for him, their branches like fingers seeking revenge. His family, struggling to rebuild their farm, burned his letters, fearing they carried the taint of the Hex House. Wilbert's quiet remorse stood in stark contrast to his brother Milton, whose defiance only grew in confinement. Milton insisted Rehmeyer had been a witch, his death a necessary act to save the county from his evil. The community, meanwhile, was fracturing under the weight of its own fears. Those who'd once relied on powwow doctors now shunned them, their faith shaken by the blood spilled in the Hollow. Churches preached against the old ways, calling them devil's work, and many practitioners hid their books, fearing retribution. Yet some held fast, practicing in secret, their whispers a faint echo of the traditions that had once defined York County. The Hex House stood as a dividing line, splitting believers from skeptics, neighbors from friends. The Hollow itself became a place of pilgrimage for the brave and the reckless. Young men, eager to prove their courage, crept to the farmhouse at night, their lanterns trembling in their hands. They returned with tales of strange noises, creaks that weren't the wind, whispers that weren't their own. One boy swore he saw a shadow move across the wall, its shape too tall to be human. His story spread, drawing more to the Hollow, each visitor adding to the legend. The Hex House was no longer just a building, it was a living myth, its power growing with every tale told. Sheriff Hoover tried to quell the rumors, patrolling the Hollow himself to prove it was just a place, not a curse. But even he couldn't deny the unease that settled in his bones as he stood before the charred door. His reports noted nothing unusual, yet he ordered his deputies to steer clear, unwilling to test the Hollow's reputation. The community took his caution as proof, whispering that even the law feared the Hex House. The Hollow became a forbidden zone, its paths overgrown, its air thick with a silence that felt alive. Rehmeyer's land, left to decay, seemed to resist nature's reclaiming. The fields refused to grow, the trees stood barren, their branches clawing at the sky. Locals said the ground was poisoned, cursed by the violence it had witnessed. Some claimed to see Rehmeyer's face in the bark of the oaks, his eyes carved in the wood, watching. A farmer who tried to plow the land fled when his horses reared, their eyes rolling in terror. He never returned, and his story became another thread in the tapestry of fear that cloaked the hollow. The powwow community, once vibrant, was fading. Practitioners like Andrew Lenhart, whose words had set Blymeyer on his path, faced ostracism. Lenhart, an old man with a voice like gravel, denied any wrongdoing, but his home was shunned, his windows broken by unseen hands. Other powwow doctors burned their books, fearing the same fate. Yet in hidden corners the old rituals persisted, passed down in whispers to those who still believed. The murder had wounded the tradition, but it couldn't kill it, its roots too deep in the county's soul. As 1897 bled into 1898, the Hex House legend grew, its shadow longer than the law's reach. The murder had stirred something primal, a fear that the hollow was more than a place. It was a gateway to something darker. Visitors spoke of a chill that wasn't the wind, a weight that pressed on their chests. Skeptics laughed, but even they avoided the hollow's paths, their steps quickening as night fell. The murder of Nelson Rehmeyer had become more than a crime. It was a story that fed on itself, growing wild in the hearts of York County, where the line between truth and terror was forever blurred. As 1898 dawned, York County's Rehmeyer's Hollow remained a place where shadows clung too tightly, where the Hex House stood as a grim sentinel of Nelson Rehmeyer's murder. The trial had ended, but its verdict couldn't silence the whispers that swirled like winter fog. John Blymeyer, Wilbert Hess, and Milton Hess were locked away, yet the hollow seemed to hold court of its own, judging the living with an eerie silence. The murder wasn't just a memory. It was a living wound, bleeding fear into the heart of the community. The Hex House, its timbers scorched but unyielding, had become a beacon for the curious and the haunted. By day, it was a ruin, its broken windows staring blankly at the fields. By night it was something else, a place where the air felt thick, where footsteps echoed without source. Locals told of lanterns flickering out, of voices calling from the dark. A young woman, daring to prove the stories false, ran from the hollow sobbing, claiming she'd felt a hand brush her neck, cold as the grave. Her tale spread, and the house's legend grew, a magnet for those drawn to the edge of fear. York County's people were no strangers to hardship, their lives carved from the stubborn earth. But the murder had shifted something fundamental, turning neighbors into strangers. Those who'd once shared bread now whispered suspicions, wondering if the hex that killed Rehmeyer still lingered. The powwow tradition, already battered, faced new threats. Preachers railed against it, calling it a path to damnation, their sermons stoking fears of witchcraft. Families hid their old books, the ones filled with chants and symbols, afraid of being branded as the next Rehmeyer. John Blymeyer, in his prison cell, was a man unmoored. His days were spent muttering prayers, his nights plagued by visions of the hollow. He claimed Rehmeyer's face appeared in the shadows, his eyes burning with accusation. Guards whispered that Blymeyer's chants grew louder at midnight, as if he were bargaining with forces no one could see. His belief in the hex never wavered. If anything, it deepened, a chain heavier than the bars that held him. He wrote no letters, spoke to no visitors, his world shrinking to the size of his guilt and fear. Wilbert Hess, serving his sentence in a nearby jail, was quieter, his remorse a private storm. He worked in the prison garden, his hands in the soil, as if he could grow atonement from the earth. In rare moments, he spoke of the hollow, describing it as a place where time felt wrong, where the air pressed against his skin. He believed the curse was real, but unlike Blymeyer, he saw no escape. His family, struggling to reclaim their farm, sent him food, but no words, their silence louder than any letter could be. Milton Hess, the youngest, burned with a different fire. His time in prison only hardened his conviction that Rehmeyer had been a witch. He argued with guards, his voice sharp, insisting the hollow was tainted, its evil untouched by their trial. He spoke of returning one day, of finishing what they'd started by burning the hex house to the ground. His defiance worried his jailers, who saw in him a spark that could ignite again. Milton's anger was a mirror of the county's unrest, a reminder that the murder's ripples hadn't yet stilled. The hollow itself was changing, or so it seemed. The fields around the Hex house stayed barren, their soil refusing seed. Hunters avoided the woods, their dogs whining at the edge. One man, a trapper named Elias Klein, swore he saw a figure in the hollow at dusk, tall and still, its face hidden by shadow. He never hunted there again, his story adding to the growing myth. Children made games of it, daring each other to touch the farmhouse door, but even they ran before night fell, their laughter thin against the hollow's weight. Sheriff Hoover, tasked with keeping order, grew weary of the tales. He sent deputies to patrol the hollow, hoping to dispel the rumors, but the men returned uneasy, their reports vague, a snapped branch, a strange chill. Hoover himself walked the hollow once, his boots crunching on frost, his lantern steady. He found nothing but ruins, yet he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He stopped the patrols soon after, telling his men to focus on the living, not the ghosts of a dead man's house. Rehmeyer's name, once spoken with caution, was now a taboo. His sister, living in a distant town, refused to speak of him, her letters unopened by those who feared his taint. The Hex house was left to decay, its roof sagging, its walls leaning inward. Yet it stood, defiant against time, as if held up by the stories it spawned. Some said the house itself was cursed, its beams soaked in Rehmeyer's blood, its foundation rooted in something darker than earth. Others believed his spirit lingered, angry or lost, unable to leave the place where he'd died. The powwow community, battered but not broken, retreated to the shadows. A few practitioners, defiant or desperate, continued their work in secret, their rituals whispered in barns or back rooms. They spoke of Rehmeyer with reverence, not fear, believing he'd been a true healer, his death a sacrifice to the county's paranoia. These believers kept his name alive, but quietly, knowing the wrong word could spark new violence. The hollow, with its silent house, became their shrine, a place where faith and fear collided. As spring crept into York County, the Hex house legend took deeper root. The murder wasn't just a crime, it was a story that grew with each telling, its edges sharper, its shadows longer. The hollow remained a place apart, its paths untrodden, its air heavy with the weight of what had been done. Who had truly killed Rehmeyer? Was his power real, or was it the fear that made it so? The answers, if they existed, were locked in the hollow, guarded by a house that refused to fall, a testament to the terror that still whispered through York County's hills. Spring's tentative warmth reached York County in 1898, but Rehmeyer's hollow remained locked in a perpetual chill, its air thick with the memory of Nelson Rehmeyer's murder. The Hex house, its charred frame unbowed, stood as a silent witness to the violence that had birthed a legend. John Blymeyer, Wilbert Hess, and Milton Hess were gone from the hollow, their lives now confined to prison cells. Yet their act lingered, a shadow that darkened every corner of the community. The murder was no longer just a crime, it was a story that grew wild, its roots sinking deeper into the county's soul. The hollow had become a place of dread, avoided by all but the boldest. Farmers rerouted their paths, their wagons creaking past the Hex house at a distance. The stories multiplied. A child who heard laughter from the empty farmhouse, a hunter whose rifle jammed as he neared the hollow's edge. One woman, gathering herbs nearby, claimed the ground pulsed under her feet, as if the earth itself breathed. These tales weren't questioned, they were believed, woven into the fabric of York County's days, each one adding weight to the belief that the hollow was cursed. John Blymeyer in his cell was a man consumed. His powwow chants grew louder, more desperate, as if he could ward off the hex he still felt. He spoke of Rehmeyer as a shadow that followed him, a presence that whispered in the dark. His guards, hardened men, grew uneasy, their nights interrupted by his fervent prayers. They said Blymeyer's eyes glowed with a strange light, as if he saw things they couldn't. He refused visitors, even his family, believing they too were tainted by the curse that had driven him to murder. His world was a cage within a cage, his mind trapped in the hollow. Wilbert Hess, in contrast, sought redemption in silence. His prison work was meticulous, tending crops, mending tools as if he could rebuild what he'd broken. He rarely spoke of the murder, but when he did, it was with a weight that aged him. He described the Hex House as a place where hope died, its walls closing in like a trap. His dreams were haunted by Rehmeyer's face, not angry but sad, as if mourning the men who'd killed him. Wilbert's family, struggling to survive, sent him prayers but no promises, their letters sparse, their farm still barren under the hollow's shadow. Milton Hess, the youngest, burned with a restless energy. His defiance hadn't faded. If anything, it grew sharper in confinement. He argued with anyone who'd listen, insisting Rehmeyer's death was justice, not murder. He spoke of the Hollow as a battlefield, where they'd fought a war against evil and lost only to the law. His words worried the warden, who saw in Milton a man unrepentant, his anger a spark that could ignite again. Milton wrote no letters, made no apologies, his mind fixed on the day he'd walk free and face the Hollow once more. York County's people tried to move on, but the Hex House wouldn't let them. The farmhouse, though abandoned, seemed alive, its windows reflecting a light that had no source. A blacksmith who ventured inside to salvage iron returned pale, saying the air felt heavy, like breathing through cloth. He found no iron, only a sense of being watched, a chill that lingered in his bones. His story spread, and the Hollow's paths grew wilder, overtaken by thorns and shadows. Children stopped playing near it, their games replaced by whispered dares no one took. The powwow tradition, once a lifeline, was now a ghost. Practitioners hid their craft, their chants whispered in locked rooms. The murder had turned their art into a liability, their books a risk. Some, like old Sarah Weaver, burned their spellbooks, the smoke curling like a prayer for forgiveness. Others, defiant, kept practicing, their rituals a quiet rebellion against the fear that gripped the county. They spoke of Rehmeyer as a martyr, his death a warning of what superstition could do when it turned on itself. Sheriff Hoover, weary of the endless tales, tried to restore reason. He posted signs warning trespassers away from the Hollow, but they were torn down, the wood splintered as if by claws. He sent no more deputies, unwilling to risk their nerves. Hoover himself avoided the Hex House, though he'd never admit why. His reports called it a nuisance, but his eyes told a different story, darting to the Hollow's edge when he passed. The community took his silence as proof, believing even the law bowed to the Hollow's power. Rehmeyer's land was left to rot, its fields a patchwork of weeds and stone. No one dared claim it, not even scavengers. A surveyor sent to assess the property fled before finishing, swearing he heard footsteps circling him. The Hollow's trees, bare and twisted, seemed to lean toward the house, their branches like arms reaching for something lost. Locals whispered that the land was alive, fed by Rehmeyer's blood, its curse growing stronger with each passing season. Some saw his face in the clouds, his voice in the wind, a presence that refused to fade. The murder had changed York County, its people now divided between those who believed and those who wanted to forget. The Hex House stood as their battleground, a place where fear and truth collided. No one could say who struck the final blow, or if Rehmeyer's power was real. The lack of answers only fueled the legend, each story a brick in its foundation. As spring turned to summer, the Hollow remained untouched, its silence louder than any verdict. The murder of Nelson Rehmeyer wasn't just a moment. It was a force, a shadow that stretched across the years, whispering of curses and the men who dared to challenge them. Summer's heat settled over York County in 1898, but Rehmeyer's Hollow stayed cold, its air heavy with the ghost of Nelson Rehmeyer's murder. The Hex House, its blackened walls sagging but unbroken, stood as a grim relic, its presence a constant reminder of the night fear turned to blood. John Blymeyer, Wilbert Hess, and Milton Hess remained behind bars, their lives reduced to echoes of the Hollow's darkness. The community, caught between dread and denial, couldn't escape the legend growing around the murder, a tale that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The Hollow had become a forbidden place, its paths choked with brambles, its silence sharper than any sound. Locals spoke of strange occurrences: a farmer who saw his lantern dim without cause, a girl who felt eyes on her back as she passed. One man, a carpenter named Thomas Lair, swore he heard a voice whisper his name from the Hex house's porch. He never returned, his hammer left behind rusted where it fell. These stories weren't mere gossip, they were warnings, each one tightening the grip of fear that held York County captive. John Blymeyer, in his prison cell, was a man unraveling. His powwow chants, once a source of strength, were now a desperate plea, his voice hoarse from endless prayers. He believed Rehmeyer's hex still clung to him, a shadow that grew darker with each passing day. Guards whispered that he scratched symbols into the walls, cryptic marks meant to ward off evil. His isolation was complete. No family came, no letters arrived. Blymeyer's world was the Hollow, its memory a chain that bound him tighter than iron. Wilbert Hess, serving his sentence with quiet resignation, worked the prison fields, his hands calloused but his spirit worn. He spoke little, but when he did, it was of the Hollow's weight, how it pressed against his chest even miles away. He wrote to his mother asking if the farm had recovered, but her replies were curt, as if she feared his words carried the curse. Wilbert's dreams were filled with the Hex house, its door swinging open to reveal Rehmeyer's face, calm but unyielding, as if waiting for an apology that would never come. Milton Hess, the youngest, was a storm contained. His anger hadn't softened. It had sharpened, honed by the monotony of prison life. He spoke of Rehmeyer as a devil, his death a battle won but not finished. Milton planned to return to the Hollow, to burn the Hex house down and break its hold. His words alarmed the guards, who watched him closely, fearing his release would spark new violence. Milton's defiance was a mirror of the county's unrest, a reminder that the murder's fire still smoldered. York County's people tried to rebuild, but the Hex house cast a long shadow. The powwow tradition, once a quiet pride, was now a whispered shame. Practitioners hid their rituals, their books buried under floorboards or burned in secret. A few, like old Hannah Klein, continued their work, their chants a defiance of the fear that gripped the county. Hannah spoke of Rehmeyer as a healer, not a hexer, his death a tragedy born of misunderstanding. Her words found few listeners, the community too scared to hear them. The Hollow itself seemed to resist the world's turning. The Hex house stood, its roof leaking but its walls firm, as if held by something beyond nature. Farmers who passed swore the air grew colder near it, their breath visible even in summer. A boy, sent to fetch water from a nearby stream, returned trembling, saying the water turned black in his pail. His mother burned the pail, fearing it was tainted. The Hollow's trees, twisted and bare, leaned toward the house, their shadows forming shapes that made travelers quicken their steps. Sheriff Hoover, tired of the endless tales, tried to reclaim the Hollow's peace. He hired men to board up the Hex house, hoping to keep trespassers out. The workers quit halfway, their tools left scattered, claiming the house groaned as they hammered. Hoover dismissed their fears but didn't replace them, leaving the boards half-nailed, the house still open to the night. He avoided the Hollow himself, his skepticism wavering in the face of its relentless pull. The community saw his retreat as proof, believing the Hex house held power no law could touch. Rehmeyer's name was a wound that wouldn't close. His sister, living far from York, refused to speak of him, her silence a wall against the county's questions. The farm was left to decay, its fields a tangle of weeds, its barn a skeleton of rotting wood. A peddler who tried to camp there fled before dawn, swearing he saw a figure in the doorway, its eyes like coals. His story spread. and the hollow became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking proof of the supernatural, their lanterns flickering as they searched for Rehmeyer's ghost. The murder had birthed a legend that refused to fade. Each story added to its weight, each whisper a brick in its foundation. The Hex House was no longer just a place. It was a presence, its power growing with every tale. Locals asked the same questions. Who struck the killing blow? Was Rehmeyer a witch, or a man undone by fear? The answers, if they existed, were locked in the hollow, guarded by a house that stood against time. As summer waned, York County lived in its shadow. The murder of Nelson Rehmeyer, a wound that bled into the land. A story that whispered of curses and the darkness they could unleash. Autumn's chill crept back into York County in 1898, wrapping Rehmeyer's hollow in a frost that felt eternal. The Hex House, its scorched frame defiant against the seasons, stood as a silent judge over the land where Nelson Rehmeyer died. The murder, now a year old, had woven itself into the county's bones, its story growing wilder with each telling. John Blymeyer, Wilbert Hess, and Milton Hess remained caged, but their act had set something free, a legend that haunted the hills, whispering of curses that no prison could contain. The hollow was a place apart, its air thick with an unease that clung to the skin. Locals spoke of lights flickering in the Hex House's windows, though no one dared approach to confirm. A shepherd, searching for a lost lamb, swore he heard a low hum from the farmhouse, like a chant carried on the wind. He fled, leaving the lamb behind, his story adding fuel to the fire of fear. The hollow's paths, once well-trodden, were now swallowed by weeds, as if the land itself rejected visitors, guarding its secrets with thorns and shadow. John Blymeyer, in his prison cell, was a shadow of the man he'd been. His powwow chants had grown frantic, his voice a rasp that echoed through the stone walls. He claimed Rehmeyer's spirit visited him, standing silent at the foot of his cot, its eyes burning with questions. Guards, unnerved, avoided his cell at night, whispering that Blymeyer's madness was contagious. He scratched more symbols into the walls, his fingers bleeding, as if he could carve a path out of the hex that still held him. His isolation was absolute, his mind a maze where the hollow was the only exit. Wilbert Hess, serving his sentence with stoic endurance, found solace in routine. He mended shoes in the prison workshop, his hands steady but his eyes distant. He spoke rarely of the murder, but when pressed he described the Hex House as a trap, its walls alive with intent. His letters home grew sparse, his family's replies colder, as if they blamed him for the farm's continued decline. Wilbert's dreams were of the hollow, its trees closing in, their branches forming a cage. He woke sweating, convinced Rehmeyer's curse was a weight he'd carry forever. Milton Hess, unbowed by confinement, burned with a restless fire. He spoke of the murder as a righteous act, his voice loud in the prison yard. Rehmeyer, he insisted, had been a plague, his death a cleansing that failed only because the Hex House still stood. Milton's plans grew bolder. He'd return, he said, and raze the farmhouse to ash. His guards watched him warily, their reports noting his unyielding anger. Milton's defiance was a spark, one that could ignite the hollow again when his sentence ended. York County's people lived in the murder's shadow, their days marked by caution. The powwow tradition, once a quiet strength, was now a whispered secret. Practitioners like old Hannah Klein faced ostracism, their doors marked with crosses by those who feared their craft. Hannah, undeterred, kept her rituals alive, her voice low as she chanted over herbs. She spoke of Rehmeyer as a misunderstood soul, his death a warning of what fear could do. Her words found few ears, the community too gripped by dread to listen. The Hex House itself was a magnet for the brave and the foolish. A group of boys, daring each other, crept to its door one moonless night. They returned pale, claiming the house groaned as they touched its frame, a sound like a beast waking. Their tale spread, drawing more to the hollow. Drifters, thrill-seekers, believers in the occult. Most found nothing but ruins, yet their stories grew, each one claiming a glimpse of something unnatural, a shadow too long, a whisper too clear. The house fed on these tales, its legend swelling with each visitor. Sheriff Hoover, warned by the endless rumors, tried to reclaim the hollow's silence. He hired a new team to board up the Hex House, but they too quit, their hammers left in the dirt. They spoke of tools slipping from their hands, of a chill that wasn't the wind. Hoover, skeptical but shaken, let the house stand open, its door a gaping wound. He avoided the hollow now, his reports curt, his eyes darting when its name was mentioned. The community saw his retreat as proof, believing the Hex House held a power no badge could challenge. Rehmeyer's land remained untouched, its fields a wasteland of stone and thorn. A traveling preacher who tried to bless the hollow fled before finishing, claiming the ground shook under his feet. His story joined the others, each one building the myth that the land was cursed, its soil soaked in Rehmeyer's blood. The hollow's trees, gnarled and barren, seemed to guard the house, their shadows forming shapes that made passers-by flinch. Some swore they saw Rehmeyer's face in the bark, his gaze following them as they hurried away. The murder had become more than a crime. It was a force shaping York County's nights. The Hex House stood as its heart, a place where fear and truth blurred. No one could say who struck the fatal blow, or if Rehmeyer's power was real. The lack of answers only deepened the legend, each story a thread in its tapestry. As autumn deepened, the hollow remained a place apart, its silence a scream that echoed through the hills. The murder of Nelson Rehmeyer was a wound that refused to heal, a story that grew wilder, whispering of curses in the darkness they could summon. As 1898 waned, York County's Rehmeyer's Hollow remained a place where time seemed to falter, its air thick with the echo of Nelson Rehmeyer's murder. The Hex House, its charred bones unyielding, stood as a monument to a crime that refused to fade. John Blymeyer, Wilbert Hess, and Milton Hess languished in their separate prisons, but the hollow held its own court, its silence louder than any verdict. The murder had birthed a legend, one that wrapped the county in a shroud of fear, whispering of curses that lingered in the frostbitten earth. The hollow was no longer just a place, it was a presence, its paths untrodden, its shadows alive. Locals spoke of strange signs, a crow circling the Hex House endlessly, a mist that rose from the ground without rain. A farmer desperate for firewood approached the hollow but turned back, swearing the trees leaned toward him, their branches clawing the air. His tale spread, joining the chorus of stories that made the hollow a forbidden land, its borders marked by fear rather than fences. The Hex House stood at its heart, a relic that seemed to breathe, its legend growing with every whispered word. John Blymeyer, in his cell, was a man broken by his own beliefs. His powwow chants had become a fevered mantra, his voice raw from endless pleas to break the hex he still felt. He claimed Rehmeyer's spirit stood watch, a silent figure in the dark, its presence a weight on his soul. Guards avoided him, their whispers spreading that Blymeyer's madness was a curse in itself. He carved symbols into his cot, his fingers trembling, as if he could ward off the hollow's pull. His life was a shadow of the murder, a loop he couldn't escape, trapped in the belief that Rehmeyer's power endured. Wilbert Hess, serving his sentence with quiet resolve, found no peace in his labor. He worked the prison laundry, his hands red from lie, his mind heavy with the hollow's memory. He spoke of it rarely, but when he did, he described the Hex House as a wound, its walls bleeding something darker than blood. His letters home stopped, his family, fearing his taint, sent no more replies. Wilbert's dreams were of Rehmeyer, standing in the hollow's fields, his eyes sad but unyielding. He woke with a start each night, convinced the curse had followed him, a chain no prison could break. Milton Hess, the youngest, burned with a fire that prison couldn't douse. He spoke of the murder as a holy act, Rehmeyer, a demon they'd failed to fully banish. He planned to return to the hollow, to burn the Hex House and end its hold. His words, sharp and unrepentant, unnerved the warden who kept him under watch, fearing his release would stir new trouble. Milton's anger was a mirror of York County's unrest, a spark that could reignite the fear that smoldered in the hills. He wrote no apologies, his mind fixed on the day he'd face the hollow again. York County's people lived in a fractured world, their faith in the old ways shattered. The powwow tradition, once a quiet strength, was now a ghost, its practitioners driven underground. Old Hannah Klein, one of the last, chanted in secret, her voice a whisper over candlelight. She spoke of Rehmeyer as a healer, his death a sacrifice to the county's fear. Her words were a faint light, ignored by a community too scared to listen. Churches filled as powwow faded, their sermons branding the old rituals as sin, yet some still clung to the chants, their faith a quiet rebellion. The Hex House drew the curious like moths to a flame. A journalist from Philadelphia, seeking a story, spent a night in the hollow and left before dawn, his notebook filled with scrawled fears, a shadow that moved without light, a voice that wasn't the wind. His article, printed in a city paper, brought more strangers to York County, their lanterns flickering as they searched for proof of the curse. Most found only ruins, but their stories fed the legend, each one claiming a glimpse of something unnatural, a figure in the doorway, a chill that wasn't the air. Sheriff Hoover, exhausted by the tales, gave up on taming the hollow. He'd tried to seal the Hex House, but the workers fled, their tools abandoned, claiming the house pushed back. Hoover let it stand, its door open to the night, its presence a challenge he couldn't meet. He avoided the hollow now, his skepticism worn thin, his reports silent on the matter. The community saw his retreat as proof, believing the Hex House was beyond the law, its power rooted in something deeper than reason. Rehmeyer's land was a wasteland, its fields barren, its trees twisted into shapes that made travelers flinch. A peddler who camped nearby fled, swearing he saw Rehmeyer's face in the firelight, his eyes glowing like embers. The hollow's curse was no longer just a story. It was a force, its weight felt by all who neared. The murder had changed York County forever, its people divided between those who believed and those who prayed to forget. The Hex House stood as their battleground, a place where fear and truth collided, its silence a scream that echoed through the hills. The murder of Nelson Rehmeyer was more than a crime. It was a seed, planted deep in the hollow's earth, its roots spreading through the years. Who struck the fatal blow? Was Rehmeyer a witch, or a man undone by paranoia? The answers, if they existed, were locked in the Hex House, its walls a vault for secrets no one dared to claim. As winter loomed, York County lived in its shadow, the legend growing wilder, its whispers carrying the weight of curses in the darkness they summoned. A story that would haunt the hollow for generations. Some say the curse died with Rehmeyer. Others whisper it still lingers, and in the soil, in the silence, in the dark corners of the hollow. A house once lit by fire, now flickers in folklore, and those who dare to look too closely. Not every shadow in York County is just a trick of the trees. You've been listening to Sanctified Secrets, where the sacred and the sinister walk hand in hand, and the truth is never holy. Subscribe if you crave what lies beneath.